Does it make sense to purchase a relatively budget mirrorless camera with a kit lens if you already have a Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra or another flagship smartphone? I've compared the Sony ZV-e10 Mark II with a kit lens with the Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra, and in my opinion those two are the best choice for this kind of video. So let's dive into it. What's good guys, my name is Oleg Nikitin, you're watching No Limits on channel, and as a little disclaimer, I'd like to tell you that I shot only in S-Log3 with this camera and only in Samsung log with the Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra. If you want to learn about log filmmaking on the Samsung more, I have a big comparison with the Apple log. I'll leave a link down below so you can watch that video after you finish this one. And in the end of this video, we'll have a photo comparison of those two cameras as well. And also I'd like to mention that I was using the Alistair Chapman free LUT with the Samsung log. It works pretty much fine. I used the same one on the Sony as well. And in the description you'll find a link to Google Drive. Those LUTs are completely free, so you can download those and use with your Samsung device. But keep in mind guys that you have to lower the saturation of the red channel. I would say it's a great conversion LUT from log to Rec. 709, but you'll have to make some tweaks to make it look perfect. And I did tweak both cameras to look exactly the same, at least to my eye. And now guys, let's take a look at the Samsung log first. As you can tell, here's ungraded and graded footage, and I was comparing it with the regular video mode in 4K, and I couldn't tell a big difference. The thing is that when I used Apple log, it reduced the over sharpening and the noise reduction of the footage a lot, but on the Samsung I don't see a dramatic difference between the regular video mode and the Samsung log graded. Unfortunately, we still have a lot of over sharpening of the footage. Now I decided to compare the 8K versus 8K regular mode versus Samsung log. It does look better because I color graded it, obviously, but when we zoom into 500% scale, we still do see a lot of over sharpening and processing. It does look slightly better, like 10 to 15% better, but nothing too crazy guys. So Samsung log is not that dramatically better. We can also say that in Samsung log we have slightly different colors and contrast when we use 4K instead of 8K, which is important to understand, and I tried to mix and match the colors, but not completely. And in terms of the details, we see that the Samsung log in 8K has less over sharpening and a bit more of noise reduction, whereas the 4K has a lot more over sharpening effect. So if you want to reduce the over sharpening, you'd better pick the 8K mode. And the 8K is quite hard for my computer to work with, and I use the M1 Pro MacBook Pro 16. And when we take a look at the skin tone and the sharpness of overall my features of the face, like the eyebrows and eyelashes, I would say that between Apple log and the regular camera mode, we see a slight difference in terms of the shadows fall off and overall skin tone, and some difference in terms of over sharpening. The log format has slightly less over sharpening, but it's still pretty much sharpened all the way, not as Apple log, which reduces sharpening dramatically. And now finally, let's take a look at the Sony ZV-e10 Mark II at 16mm f3.5 in 4K compared to Galaxy S25 Ultra in 4K as well. 1x camera, you can read the settings in the lower part of the image. When we zoom in, we can definitely tell that Samsung has a lot of over sharpening. And guys, keep in mind that you can definitely have the same exact image if you add sharpen effects to your Sony ZV-e10 footage, but I don't like over sharpened footage. That is why I do prefer the Sony in this regard. And here is exactly the same color grading of the 4K and 8K on the Samsung, and you can tell a huge color difference between those two, but the 8K doesn't look as over sharpened as the 4K. So here we have the 8K mode versus the 4K on the Sony. The 8K does have slight magenta color shift, so you'll need to color grade it in a different way, and if you mix and match 4K and 8K, it's not as convenient. When we zoom in 500% scale, we can see that 8K doesn't look as over sharpened and much closer in terms of the image quality to the Sony ZV-e10 Mark II, but the colors and overall noise reduction are more aggressive than on the Sony. When we take a look at the skin tones of both, you can get away with both of those cameras, especially in 8K mode and 1x camera on the Samsung, the biggest sensor of course. And when we zoom into 300% scale, you can tell that it does look okay, but still over sharpened. So I can add the sharpening effect to my Sony camera and get more or less the same result, but I do see some artifacts of noise reduction on the Samsung footage. I hope YouTube didn't destroy the footage and you'll be able to see those differences like I see them. And also I'd like to mention that I did use like masking my part of the forehead and use the vectorscope to get the exactly right skin tone, and I used the skin tone indicator on the vectorscope on both camera systems and tried to match the skin tone as precise as possible, and you can see some slight changes in the code, which is blur on the Samsung and more like magenta on the Sony, but the skin tones should be more or less identical in both of those. And then guys, we're comparing the 4K on the Samsung versus Sony ZV-e10, and the 4K does look pretty much over sharpened to my eye. It doesn't look like a log footage at all. To my eye, it looks exactly the same as if you are using the regular mode on the Samsung, which is not my favorite part of this smartphone. And when we zoom in 300% scale, you can see a dramatic difference in over sharpening, and I'll show you the test footage when I do add sharpening effect to my Sony ZV-e10, and you'll see that the images are exactly the same. If I don't add the sharpening, the image is much softer, but it has the real detail, whereas the Samsung has a ton of over sharpening just thrown on the top of the image. Here's the side-by-side comparison of 4K versus 8K on the Galaxy, and here you can clearly see the over-sharpening effect on the 4K. And previously, Samsung phones had pretty bad 4K 60, but this time the 4K 60 is exactly the same as the 4K 30, which is very nice. Then I tried to use my 1x camera of the Samsung indoors in the same lighting conditions as you see me right now, and I would say that I still prefer the Sony image a lot more because of the over sharpening in 4K. So here is no post sharpening on the Sony, and here it is with post sharpening, and it looks exactly the same in terms of sharpness, kind of sharpness, not the level of detail, but the sharpness itself, kind of adding a lot of micro contrast to the edges of the objects as the Samsung phone. So I decided to check if the 8K is going to give me a better result, and it does give me less over sharpening and all in all better image, but still guys, I would prefer the image of the ZV-e10 Mark II, even with the kit lens, which has pretty poor image quality, to be honest, it's still better. One more thing is that I see a color banding even on my editing program with the Samsung phone, and if I see the banding in my NLE, I'm not sure how it will be on the YouTube, but it'll be much worse. So in terms of the bit depth, I guess that the Samsung is not using a true 10-bit, probably, or maybe it does, but it's not as convenient and as robust as the Sony's codecs with 10-bit. So here is the comparison of the 4K versus 8K 1x camera Samsung log, and you can see that the 8K does look much better, but when we zoom in I can see the artifacts of digital noise reduction. It has a lot more noise reduction, but less over sharpening. So I would use 8K indoors, but as I said guys, it's not the easiest footage to work with. Then I decided to check the low light capabilities, and it's dark as hell in here, and I'm using the 32,000 ISO on the ZV-e10 Mark II and 3200 ISO on the Samsung in 4K, and on the Sony you can see a lot of noise, but it's filmic-like, and when we zoom in we can definitely see that Sony retains a lot more details and that the noise reduction on the Samsung is very strong. It's super heavy, I cannot even see the bricks in the building itself, and we see a ton of noise reduction and blocking color, whereas on the Sony you could use like the noise reduction tool in DaVinci Resolve and get much better results with this type of noise, whereas on the Samsung it's pretty much ruined. Here is the difference between 8K and 4K with the same color grading. As you can tell, we still have a huge difference in terms of color, so if you mix and match 4K and 8K while filming in Samsung log, you'll be having some hard times trying to compare those two. But in terms of the image quality, 8K is slightly better in low light. It still retains more details, I can more clearly see the bricks, and it has a bit less digital noise reduction in this regard than the 4K. And here is the comparison of the 8K on the Samsung versus Sony ZV-e10 Mark II, 32,000 ISO as before, and still guys, I cannot fight with this magenta color cast properly. It still remains in the image, and when we zoom in 500%, you can tell that still the Sony ZV-e10 Mark II has much cleaner image in terms of the sharpness and noise reduction, and you'll be able to get better image if you use noise reduction in post with the ZV-e10 Mark II. Here is the skin tone comparison, and I would highly recommend you guys use the 1x camera on your Samsung or your iPhone when you film in low light, because it's the only camera that can provide you with good enough, like decent results in low light. Here I'm using the 6400 ISO on the Sony and 3200 on the Samsung, and I don't like how Samsung renders my skin. I can see a lot of noise reduction, my skin looks smoother than it is, I don't see any wrinkles on my skin, and of course I do have some wrinkles, as you can probably tell on my skin. On the Samsung it appears to be very smooth and softened. And here is the 8K on the Samsung versus Sony ZV-e10, and the results are still not great. I would say that in the 8K we still retain a lot of noise reduction and a bit of an over sharpening effect, and the autofocus also doesn't work properly, so I think probably missed the focus with the Samsung in this regard, so don't judge the sharpness of this. So the autofocus works worse in low light on the Samsung for sure. And here you can see how the focus drifts from my face to the background on the 4K. So all in all, I would use 8K in low light, but I would highly recommend finding a better lit spot, like under a pole or somewhere, because if it is very dark, you'll get pretty much bad results with the Samsung log, or basically any camera to be honest. And here is the vlogging test comparison: 16mm f3.5, which is a 24mm full frame equivalent, versus 1x camera in Samsung log. And don't look at the image stabilization because the ZV-e10 Mark II doesn't have one, and we'll have a proper test of stabilization and vlogging later on in the video. But in terms of the image quality, I much prefer the image from the Sony camera because it has less artifacts in terms of light leaks, less artifacts in terms of overall skin and noise reduction, etc. So if you're okay with using a 3-axis gimbal with your Sony camera, you'll get better results even with this dark lens. And guys, let's move on to the 0.6x camera on the Samsung 4K. On the Sony, we don't have as wide of a lens in the kit lens, so we'll have to use a different lens to get a wider field of view. And here is the difference in terms of the whiteness, as you can tell. And this image is more or less just a representation of the image quality of the 0.6x camera. And it's of course worse, much worse than the 1x camera on the Samsung. Of course, guys, this comparison is not quite honest. It's just a demonstration of the capabilities of the 0.6x camera. And here is the 8K on the 0.6x camera. It still retains a different color. As we had before, between 4K and 8K we have different colors ever so slightly, but the image quality is getting a bit better in terms of over sharpening. It's not as over sharpened, but we still have a ton of noise reduction, and the image simply appears to be a bit more blurry. Here is the skin tone comparison, and you can see the difference in whiteness between 24mm field of view, like full frame equivalent, versus 0.6x camera on the Samsung, which is about like 15 to 16mm field of view in full frame equivalent. And here is the 8K comparison. 8K does look slightly better, at least to my eye. I'm not sure if it looks better to your eye, but to mine, definitely 8K is better. And here is the comparison of the 4K versus 8K. Same story here, more over sharpening on the 4K, more noise reduction and slightly blurrier image on the 8K, but you can add some sharpening to the 8K footage and get more or less better results. Anyways, I wouldn't use the 0.6x camera for some like serious filmmaking. It's just a fun lens to use. So here you can see the difference in field of view in low light situations, 3200 ISO, 4K, 0.6x camera, and the results are pretty much unusable. And when we zoom in 500%, you can see just a pixelated mess of noise reduction and blurriness. So don't use 0.6x camera at night, just use the 1x camera and you'll get a lot better results. On the Samsung we also have a 3x camera which cannot record in 8K. It's a pretty small sensor as well, and on the Sony we have 45mm f5.6 at the moment because it does have smaller aperture when you zoom in. But in terms of the image quality, it is still miles ahead of the 3x camera, so Sony definitely does win in this category. Here is the comparison of my face, and you can still see some background blur and separation on the Sony, no matter we're using the crop sensor camera, and the f5.6 aperture still has some background blur, whereas on the Samsung it's simply like everything is in focus. When we zoom in 300%, it doesn't look super bad on the Samsungs. It still has less details and more over sharpening, as you can tell from my hair. But all in all, guys, it's okay camera to use in good lighting conditions. But when it comes to the low light shots, it's a lot worse. Tiny sensor, bad ISOs, all in all, super blurry, super noise reduced. I wouldn't use this 3x camera on the Samsung in low light. And here is the 5x camera on the Samsung in 4K, and on the Sony we'll have to go to clear image zoom mode, 1.5x digital crop, let me say, and the image quality is slightly better on the Samsung due to the optical zoom, not the digital zoom as we use on the Sony. When we use 8K, it does have slightly less over sharpening than on the 4K mode on the Samsung. And when we zoom in, we can see that the 8K does look slightly blurrier because we have more noise reduction, but still it has less over sharpening, which I prefer. Here is the comparison of the 4K versus 8K, and as I said, I would prefer using the 8K, but you have to be really stable with your 5x camera. Even on the tripod you can get some not really good results. And when we compare the skin tones, both look nice. Samsung has a lot more over sharpening and the Sony has slight background blur, optical blur, which I prefer. And if you are curious, here is the night shot. On the Sony we're at 5.6 with clear image zoom, but still we retain better details, less noise reduction, and overall better image quality. So with the Galaxy S25 Ultra, I wouldn't use any lenses except for the 1x camera, because in low light situations, 0.6x, 3x, and 5x, they really are struggling. So just use 1x in low light and find some better lit spots.
But on the Samsung, guys, we have a pretty cool feature, which is called dual recording. So you can see my little setup for this filmmaking test, and I can simultaneously record myself, or we can switch the cameras. It's like this, I guess, or like this, or somehow in a different fashion. Whoa. So you got the idea. So you can basically record two things at once, which you cannot do obviously with a real camera.
So here we have the portrait mode. It's not in Samsung log, and you have pretty decent background separation. It does work more than okay in my opinion. You still have some artifacts near my hair and my ears, and also between my arms. Occasionally it can give some artifacts, and also when I show you my fingers, you can see some artifacts between those fingers. It is miles better than on the Samsung Galaxy S23 Ultra or S22 Ultra especially, but you still cannot adjust the amount of background blur and separation afterwards like you can on the Apple devices, like on the iPhone. And you can also use this mode in 1x or in 2x crop mode. You do get more background blur, but you can still have some artifacts, so this mode is not as reliable as the optical blur of a real camera with a bigger sensor.
And guys, here is a little vlogging test. As you might know, Sony ZV-e10 Mark II doesn't have IBIS whatsoever, but the kit lens does have OSS, and probably you can see some jitter in the ZV-e1 footage, whereas the Samsung should have much more smoother image. And guys, here is the audio test as well. You can hear the microphone of the ZV-e10 Mark II, and now the microphone of the Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra. How do you like the results? Please let me know down in the comment section below. And as well, guys, you can see the background blur at separation of those two cameras, with the 1x camera on the Samsung and with the 16mm f3.5 on the ZV-e10 Mark II. But also, guys, the ZV-e10 has an active steady shot mode, which crops in the image for about 1.5 times or 1.4 times. It's a lot of a crop, and the stabilization is super digital in my opinion, but still you can see a tighter field of view, of course, but it should be more stable. But still, I don't think this camera is great for vlogging without any gimbal, whereas on the Samsung it's probably more than possible. And don't forget, guys, that on the Samsung you have the ultra-wide camera as well for a wider field of view for your vlogging tasks, but the ZV-e10 Mark II has a flippable screen, which is very nice to frame your shot properly.
Here's the ZV-e10 Mark II with the optical stabilization only at 16mm and 0.6x camera on the Samsung, and the difference is like night and day, so definitely Samsung will be a lot better. On the Sony we have an active mode, as I said, and here you have a little crop of 1.4x. It's not a little crop, it's a pretty big crop, and you have a bit worse image quality as well. It does get better, but not as fluid as the Samsung, so with the Sony I would highly recommend using a gimbal if you want to do those kind of shots. And now, guys, one of the most important tests is dynamic range. The ZV-e10 Mark II has exactly the same image sensor as the Sony FX30, around 11 to 12 stops of clean dynamic range in S-Log3. And now let's take a look at the Samsung, and I was exposing for the sky, and you guys cannot even see what's happening on my face or in the area of my coat. It's simply not there, and we have a lot of artifacts. You see the stripes on my coat, and also you can see how I have a ton of artifacts on my face, like green and magenta artifacts and blocks of colors. So the dynamic range on the Samsung is much worse, no matter you're using the log mode, which should kind of improve this. But guys, it's just a mess. So if you do care about dynamic range and overall good image quality, I would highly recommend picking the Sony camera, because Samsung log is not giving me the best results, even in log. Even with the 1x camera, it's just a mess, guys, unfortunately. One more irritating thing is that Blackmagic camera app, my favorite app, of course, it doesn't support Samsung log as for now. At the moment of recording this video, we still have only 709 and BT 2020 in 8K, in 4K, in HD. And I would love to use Blackmagic camera to record with Samsung log, to bake in the LUT, etc. But as for now, guys, it's not an option. Also, guys, there is one more pretty irritating factor, is that the false color tool and the zebras, they are not working properly. So as you can tell, the image is now completely overexposed, but still we don't see an overexposure warning like the yellow or red color on the false color, and only when we have more or less properly exposed image you can see some false color showing up on the screen. And I also didn't find a native ISO for Samsung log, because at all ISO values we still don't have proper zebras. So let me show you. You see that we have zebras only at about 75. When we go to zebras at 80, they simply disappear. So they are not properly working, and it is not reliable and usable whatsoever. And unfortunately, Apple log has exactly the same issue with false color and zebras. I'm not sure why they can't fix it, and I even have a full video about it, top 5 issues of Apple log. I'll leave a link down below. Now let's compare the photos. On the One X camera we have 3 different resolutions, 12, 50 and 200 megapixels, and you can see that the colors are slightly different between those 3 modes. When we zoom in 500% scale, you can tell that the 50 megapixel look okay, more or less the best, and I don't see a reason to use 200 megapixel with this smartphone because 50 is plenty sharp. So here's the comparison with a 24 megapixel JPEG photo on the Sony ZV-e10 with the One X camera 12 megapixel. The Sony is better and the Samsung has a lot of over sharpening, but when we use 50 megapixel mode, we get a lot better image and it's more or less comparable. 200 megapixel is slightly strange in my opinion, so I wouldn't use this mode. Here's the difference of the 0.6x camera with the 16mm on the Sony, and here's the image quality comparison between 12 megapixel on the Samsung 0.6x camera and 50 megapixel. And as you can tell guys, the 50 megapixel is way better, so just use the 50 megapixel image. Here is the comparison of 3x camera, 12 megapixel photo and 45mm f5.6 on the Sony, and Sony just destroys 3x camera on the Samsung. A lot less over sharpening, less digital post-processing, all in all much better. Now we had to go into the digital crop on the Sony camera 0.5x, and here is the 5x camera at 12 megapixel. It does look sharper, but it's super processed, and when we switch to 50 megapixel photo, it is a lot better, so the 5x camera is decent at 50 megapixels on the Samsung. Here's 1x comparison with the skin tone. It does look okay at 12 megapixels, but a bit over sharpened. When you use 50 megapixels, you get even better results, but no background separation as on the Sony. And here's the 200 megapixel JPEG shot, and it's not super different from the 50 megapixel. Here is the portrait mode on 1x camera, and it did a great job to be honest, so the cutout is very nice, the hair, the ears, just perfect. Here is a 3x camera comparison. The Sony looks a lot better in my opinion, and as you can tell the image is much more natural on the Sony. And here is the comparison of a portrait mode. It did great once again, so the cutout on the 3x camera is also pretty good. And now we have a digital crop of 1.5x on the Sony, 5.6 aperture and 12 megapixel on the Galaxy. It's okay, and if we add sharpen to the image on the Sony, it's more or less comparable. So Samsung just adds the sharpening straight away, whereas I do prefer to have some control over the sharpening in post. And also with the portrait mode on the Galaxy, I did take 2 pictures and both had issues with the cutout, so probably it's not the best way to do portraits. You'd better pick a fast glass for your Sony ZV-e10 and you have much better results. In terms of macro capabilities, here is the wide angle 0.6x and 16mm. It's okay. I mean, it's far from macro on the Sony, but I don't like the distortion on the 0.6x camera. Here is the comparison with the 1x camera, pretty decent minimal focus and distance, and here's the 5x camera and the maximum magnification on the Sony at 50mm, quite decent results on both. In the low light, I did use 1/30th shutter speed in the manual mode. Here is the 0.6x camera, and not the best result to be honest. 1x camera at 12 megapixel does look better. When we zoom in, the Sony still rocks, it's a much better result. So here we have the 50 megapixel on the Samsung, and it's decent, a bit better, but still super noisy and over-processed. And here's the proper 5x exposure on the tripod and the night mode on the Galaxy, and this is what you get. But still I can see some bending on the Samsung photo. Probably YouTube will show you some bending on the Sony photo as well, but the Sony is super clean, whereas the Samsung does have slight artifacts straight out of the gate. And just for fun, here's 1/30th of a shutter speed with the 3x camera, pretty poor results on both, and the 5x camera, also pretty bad ones, so I wouldn't use those in the low light, even for photos, without the night mode or the tripod. And here's the comparison with the portrait mode at night. It also did a pretty good job. And now guys, there are some other things to consider, like the battery life. So on the ZV-e10 Mark II, the battery life is pretty good. In 4K 25 or 30 FPS, I can get about 2.5 hours from this pretty beefy battery. But on the Samsung, I've been recording an overheating test, and it was about 1 hour in 8K 30. The file size was 36 gigs, so 1 second is around 10 megabytes, just for the reference. The phone was hot, the screen was dimmed slightly, but still it didn't overheat, which is nice, and also it was 25% battery after this 1 hour test, so from 100 to 75%, so this phone will last you about 4 hours if you record an AK30 Samsung log. I always try to call it Apple log, but it's a Samsung log. And since we're talking about the overheating, the ZV-e10 Mark II can overheat in 4K 60, so you'll need an external cooler if you need to record at 4K 60 for like more than 50 minutes. There is an issue with the Samsung because it doesn't have a constant frame rate. So if you are recording at 30 frames per second, in the file you'll see 30.1, 30.2 frames per second, so it's not constant, and I constantly get a drift from my Sony camera or from my iPhone camera. So I cannot use this phone properly as a B cam or C cam with my Sony cameras, whereas on the iPhone I could do this because I had more or less constant frame rate and there wasn't such big of a drift. And with this phone, every like 1 or 2 minutes I get a very huge drift in terms of the audio, so it's not as reliable, and I really hope that Samsung will improve it with a firmware update. One more thing to consider is that the Samsung phone does crop in the video mode. For example, the One X camera is stated to be about 23mm full frame equivalent, and the iPhone is stated to be 24mm full frame equivalent. But when you place the phone in exactly the same spot, in my studio for example, you can see that the Samsung does crop in the image. That is why it gets lower resolution. I mean, you don't use the entire sensor first, and you also get tighter image. And you don't want a tighter image, and maybe you do want a tighter image. It's just something to consider that the Samsung does crop in at all the cameras, 0.6x, 1x, 3x, 5x. It crops in more than it is stated on the kind of like a Blackmagic camera app, for example. And of course, guys, with this phone, you can use it in the elements, in the heavy rain, in the desert, whereas this Sony camera doesn't have any weather sealing basically, so even a heavy rain would probably kill this camera, so I don't recommend using this camera in the rain or the desert or whatsoever. So props to Samsung. Of course, guys, the Samsung has much better display, it's a bigger display, it's brighter, it's much easier to see it in the harsh sunlight, but guys, the ZV-e10 has a flippy screen, as I said, and the flippy screen is much more usable when you're trying to get like a low angle or a high angle or to film yourself, so it's a draw here, I guess. One more thing is the ease of use. If you don't want to mess around with the S-Log3 on this camera, if you don't want to like edit raw photos or something, the Samsung is much easier. You just take a picture or a video and you post it to your social networks. But if you want to get the most out of your Samsung or your Sony camera, you'll have to edit the photos and the videos, and especially the Samsung log. Not all in all, Samsung is just easier to use. And guys, of course, the elephant in the room, the interchangeable lens system. So this lens is pretty poor, to be honest. It's not as sharp, it's pretty versatile, but it's slow, basically. And the Sony E-mount has a ton of glass, like more than 500 different lenses, including vintage lenses for like 10 to 20 bucks with great image quality. You have a lot of Chinese autofocus lenses with pretty good characteristics as well. You can get wide-angle shots, you can get macro lenses, you can get like super telephoto lenses, you can get anything you want for this Sony E-mount system, and it's much more future-proof than the Samsung. Of course, you can use like external lenses with the Samsung, you can use some filters, but other than that, you're pretty much stuck to the cameras you have right now in this smartphone. Whereas on the camera you have like limitless capabilities. It's not even comparable, guys. So if you are serious about your photography game or videography game, the camera would be a much better choice. And guys, finally about the prices, the official retail prices for the Samsung 256 gigs are $1,300, which is not cheap by any means. The ZV-e10 Mark II with a kit lens and a special bundle on B&H is $1,100 with an extra battery and an SD card. But even if you buy it for $1,100 as is, just one battery and the lens, you can buy an additional 256 gigs SD card by Lexar for 50 bucks. It'll be $1,150 for this camera. And this is a much better purchase in my opinion. So if you have like an older Samsung phone like S21, not even an Ultra model, this will give you much better results in low light, much better results overall in terms of photos and videos. And especially considering that we have interchangeable lenses, it'll be miles ahead of the Samsung if you use better glass. So guys, my final conclusion, what's better, a flagship phone or a mirrorless camera with a kit lens? I would say I would buy a camera, because it has much more versatile system in terms of switchable lenses, much more future-proof, and overall the image quality is better in almost all the boxes, all the areas I've tested it, aside from several things that are not as important to me at least. So if you're a blogger and you record talking head portions in the studio, it'll give you a better result. If you have some client work, it'll give you a better result. It is super versatile because of the external, like interchangeable lenses, of course. And the Samsung would be nice only if you use it as a travel vlogging camera, if you walk with your camera a lot and you don't want to bring a gimbal to this camera. And other than that, I didn't really enjoy the Samsung log. It was much worse than I expected to be. If you want to get the most out of your smartphone, the Galaxy smartphone or any other Android smartphone, you have to use RAW with Motion Cam Pro, for example, and it's a much more clunky and finicky process to get better results. So in my opinion, I would pick the camera and stay with an older smartphone instead of buying a new one. So what do you think about it? Please let me know down in the comment section below. And if you do respect my effort of making this detailed video in comparison, please smash the like and subscribe button and hit the notifications bell. And right here, guys, you can see the full comparison of Apple log versus Samsung log and all the differences between those two and which one is better. So see you in that video, guys. Take care. Bye.